And good morning. Here we are live in the Storycraft Cafe or the Storycraft Bistro as Steve/Jamie finishes his delicious carnivore breakfast and makes us all hungry.
Josh took
Today,
coffee off of his keyboard.
right? We had a whole discussion about where Josh got his coffee from and how the rest of the country distributes its food between Hardee's and Carl's Jr. That matters to nobody but us, but we just
It
thought we'd
actually,
like to.
I just want to point out that coffee is a great desk cleaning thing because my desk was covered with like just dust and stuff because I'm horrible at clean. And then you spill coffee on it, you got to wipe it all up. It's like the one and only cleaning solvent that you can use.
I just want to point out. I'm sorry, Hank. I know we're
No.
getting tangents again. I just want to point out that Josh is a Dragon Award nominee, and his only way of describing that was coffee is a great desk cleaning
thing. It's a desk cleaning thing. Look, I didn't have time to open up the Tharth.com.
Well, this is proof that Josh is a great editor of his writing and not,
see,
Hey,
just eat your food. Take Jamie out of this. Like, just click his camera off. Leave him out of this discussion.
It's
I had a burrito.
Yeah, yuppie. Anyway, hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the show.
As we continue our discussion of writing/rewriting, today I thought a great topic to discuss would be writing advice, writing rules that people swear by, and whether those things are actually true in real life slash production. And one of the most common illustrations of that would be Stephen King's book on writing. He has some very definitive rules that he says always do this, never do this. And then you see other writers, like, for instance, one of his rules that gets bandied about a lot is never use adverbs. And then J.K. Rowling and Neil Gaiman have never met an adverb that they didn't love.
It's true.
Robert Jordan.
Robert Jordan. I mean, we could name as many authors as you can imagine. So that rule that Stephen King came up with is obviously not true for everyone all the time, because there are people arguably at least as popular, if not maybe more so than Stephen King, who say otherwise. So
well, something about that rule really quickly is like,
yeah,
you have to look at the genre and the age that the reader is. Like you mentioned J.K. Rowling, and you're right. Yeah. She uses adverbs all the time.
Right.
And she uses them in dialogue a lot too. But the audience that she's writing for might not necessarily take the context of what she's trying to say had she not used adverbs, because they're younger readers. And so you can, as an adult reader, you want to say something like he said excitedly, but you figure out a way to present that in context without using those adverbs. But in the younger reader category, you might not want to do that. You just want to put it in front of them so they understand 100% that, okay, this person is excited or they're nervous or whatever. So sometimes that rule really kind of is dictated by the reader that you're trying to write to and the age of that reader.
Am I allowed to?
I'm glad you said that, because I've never considered that. No. Honestly, that's a great take that I've never really thought about.
Am I allowed to be a little controversial this morning?
Absolutely.
When are you not controversial?
I plan to be controversial this morning, so go ahead.
Here's a little inside baseball just for listeners, that I like to throw an article to the guys the day before, sometimes when I'm thinking about it, and expecting hot takes the next day, hoping that the article I send them will strike a nerve or have someone frothing over when they come in. So anyway, go ahead, Steve.
Let's talk Stephen King for 1 second. let's talk about a guy who in his own book tells us how many times Carrie was rejected, only to be picked up by a company for $250,000 in the
And that's
early
1970s dollars, right?
late
Yeah.
70s.
Late
Thank you.
70s.
That's
yeah.
$4 billion
Right.
in today's dollars.
As a publisher, that tells me something, but I'm gonna leave out all that stuff, right? Stephen
Yeah.
King fell into a career that was based on a book that became a movie that then opened up the door for him to write whatever he wanted for the rest of his life.
I thought you were about to say he fell in front of a van, but go ahead.
He did not. He did fall in front of a van as well. I've
Yeah,
read Stephen
that
King's
was
books.
later.
I enjoy Stephen King's books, but I'm just going to say that somebody who stumbles into a career at a time when publishing was in the state that it was in should not necessarily be giving writing advice. If he were to give writing advice, number one on that list would be don't interject your politics into every freaking book that you write to a point where it makes everyone that read it want to throw up, even if we agree with him.
And also, don't do that much cocaine anymore.
Right? But Stephen King writing on writing, I read that and I went, not all of this applies to every single person writing every kind of book that there is.
Right.
Yet he wrote it with such authority that it was sickening.
Such authority.
Sickening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if Stephen King ever listens to this, I'm sorry, man. That book you need a rewrite because all of us are going, this doesn't apply anymore. And adverbs are fine if you're a writer that can get away with writing adverbs. Money sells, man, or money talks. And if people are selling books,
if
Money
you look at
talks,
the cover of
sells.
On Writing and you see that giant pet computer behind him on the the 4 megahertz computer on his desk,
5 1/4 floppy disks that hold like 2 words.
that tells you the era that book was written.
And then, like, don't steal X-Men, call it the Institute, and make believe that you did something extraordinary. I take issue with people quoting On Writing all the time as if he is some authority on writing, when, quite frankly, the books they're great stories written elementary style.
Well, and you have to take the works for what it is, and you take Stephen King for example, since we're talking about him, and he does in a lot of his books really good character work, but his 9 out of 10 of his endings suck.
Yeah.
And so you can read the book and enjoy the characters, but if you're looking for a fulfilling ending, that might not be the book you're looking for. But you can take bits and pieces out of his work and go, this is really good, I'm going to use that. But like Steve said, just to take his book On Writing as like a blueprint for what you should do or what should be done 100% of the time, like one of the things they say about writing is if you want to be a good writer, you have to have time to read, because if you don't read, you're not going to grow your fundamental toolbox as a writer. And read a lot of different types of books. The one genre I don't really read is romance. That doesn't really intrigue me at all. But if you look at, like, let's just say Nick Sparks writes phenomenal books that have powerful endings, that have really good characters. And you can take Mark Greaney, who writes fantastic action sequences and has like pretty fulfilling endings. And then you can take bits and pieces of those books and put them into your toolbox and use those deals. But all of those books are written with different rules. And so you can kind of bend those rules different ways to apply to your own writing.
There's
I have another Stephen King hot take. I have read so many Stephen King books up to about 55% and then just bail.
Well, it's like 11/28/6 or whatever it is, the one where the I mean, that book is so long and there's so many things that happen in that book. Like eventually you could just get to the part where you're tired of reading it because you want the main plot to fulfill something, and it's not, because they're dancing around everything and takes so long to get, and there's not really any reason for it.
Well, if I can offer an opinion about authors like Stephen King, to some extent Michael Crichton, maybe even not to besmirch the dead, but Tom Clancy. They make it big with a book that really hits, which may be the quality of the book, it may be timing, it may be the needs of the publisher, but for some reason that book hits, and people start to read them out of habit. People who want to read a thriller think, oh, that's Clancy. That's a thriller. Everybody likes Clancy. I'm going to pick it up. And at that point, you'll understand that the casual reader doesn't care about all these rules. They just want a good story. And sometimes they're willing to flip through a few pages that they're not interested in to get to the good story. If it's
sure.
somebody like Tom Clancy or Stephen King or Michael Crichton. So
Yeah.
I feel like those people giving advice on how to write, like Hank said, it's kind of misplaced because they don't know why their writing was successful. They don't know that it was because they didn't use adverbs or because
Right.
they did this or that. There's a whole. It's the same thing with with indie writers. You know, they want to. I see people teaching classes like, "This is how you're successful because it worked for me." Well, no, it worked for you in this circumstance, in this time, you know, because of your genre, all these other things. But that was a huge mesh of things, and you can't guarantee it's going to work for anybody else. And the same is true for the advice Stephen King gives on writing. There has been literally hundreds and hundreds of successful writers who have broken the rules that Stephen King set down and been successful.
Well, and to talk about like rules, like you said, the reader doesn't necessarily care about the rules of writing. Like and that goes well beyond just the rules of writing. The reader doesn't really care about structure and all that. They just want a good story. And it's the writer's job to understand that stuff and present it so the reader can understand it. But like when you talk about rules, sometimes those rules are based around the time that they were created. On writing was what, 30 years ago or something. But then look at like the indie revolution. Silo is getting ready to come out this month based on the stories by Hugh Howey. And Hugh Howey nailed the indie market right at the beginning with Wool and the short novella type 5-part books and then put it in an omnibus. But he did that in a time where that specific thing was big and he nailed it. And if he had written the same book now, I highly doubt that it would have the same impact that it did back then. It's kind of like Michael. Well, it's kind of like Michael Bunker in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania took off because he did a couple things with Hugh Howey. Everybody liked Hugh Howey. Bunker was doing the same thing with Philadelphia, writing the small stories. I even tried to do that, but I was unsuccessful in doing it. But you have to look at not only the rules of writing that make it popular, but what they're doing at that specific time. Right now, everybody's doing a book a month. 10 years ago, that was not a thing, and who's to say that that's going to be a thing next year or in 5 years or whatever else. And that's not technically rules
with
about.
AI, it may be a book a week.
Well, yeah.
Well, when I started, I published my first book 10 years ago, and the prevailing wisdom at the time was publish quickly, didn't matter, don't edit, get as much out there as you can, and hijack the Kindle
Algorithms.
algorithms, and I published some stuff early on that I was, not proud of, and that I, wish that I hadn't, and I pulled that stuff down, and I published stuff with my wife under a pen name, and have got a lot of stuff going, but I haven't published a whole lot under my name because I'm like skittish of mistakes made early on, and
For sure.
which brings me to with one of the first things that I kind of wrote out in notes: done is better than perfect. What one thing there's so much bad advice out there, but you can become so obsessed with taking everyone's advice that you just never finish anything because it's just not perfect. And there comes a point where just being done and getting out is better than being perfect. So what do you guys think about that adage that done is better than perfect?
I definitely agree with that. I feel like there's somebody once said that no manuscript's ever done or never finished. You just give up on it. And I feel like how much time you have to spend on it depends on how much experience you have. But at some point, you have to just say, I can't spend my whole life making this book perfect. Yeah, nobody's ever going to read it.
There's kind of an 80-20 type of rule that when you get to a point, you have to weigh the pros and cons. And in writing today, you have your breakouts once or twice a year, your major sellers, the ones that explode, where at that point the question becomes, again, timing versus is it really that good a book? And of course, all of us have read several of the big bestsellers and we go, I don't know why this did what it did, because it's certainly appealing, but at the same time, like, this isn't the best written book ever. And I don't know why it's doing what it's doing. And if you spend 3 years writing a book that performs like the majority of ebooks, you will have wasted 3 years of your life. I say that with love, but I say that truthfully. Even the best-selling books that we have are books that have been written in 1 to 4 months. In some individual cases, maybe it took them a year, right? But then the sequels were written a hell of a lot quicker than that because they realized the speed at which things need to be done. But in this particular market that we live in, you cannot afford, if you're writing for money, that's an important thing too, that I think we've talked about before. We need to define our purposes and what success looks like to us. And if putting out the best book you could have ever written is your purpose, then take your time. Who cares?
Yeah.
If having a career is the goal, then you can't waste that much time on a book because it might not do anything and you need to be ready to move on to your next book.
Well, and when it comes to rules too, like it takes a long time to understand the difference in breaking a rule correctly and then just writing without regard to the rules. Like, for instance, like contractions or adverbs. Contractions are a big thing because in some genres, contractions are not a thing. Like in epic fantasy or fantasy in general, you can write without contractions, and that's the way those books are written. And a lot of people in those books speak without contractions, and it sounds very formal because that's the type of language that they were using, or that we feel like that they're using in that setting, right? And so there are fantasy books that have contractions, like Brandon Sanderson. His fantasy is filled with contractions.
Right.
So you could spend, like you said, you could spend all this time trying to figure out if you're breaking a rule or not, or figuring out what the rules are in general and not writing. It's the same thing with like reading a whole bunch of books on writing, right? Like if you're reading technique books or story books or plot books or whatever, I have tons of them and I've read most of them. And what I think is detrimental to writing now is that a lot of people come into this space and just say, I have a story to tell, I'm just going to write it and publish it, instead of spending years honing that craft and writing a book. Now, I'm not saying that you can't write a good book on your first time out, because it is possible, but the majority of us have books in a bookshelf that we've written 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 10 years ago, last year, and they absolutely suck and no one's ever going to read them. And so I think the best way...
I don't have my bookshelf. I got rid of those.
Yeah. I've got mine in a briefcase somewhere. I've got millions of words in a briefcase that will never see the light of day, and that's all part of the process.
Now we have a plan to steal that briefcase.
Who wrote the rules? That's a great, like that.
Well,
should
and
be
that's
foundational.
100%. Right.
Who wrote the rules and why do we care what they have to say?
Right. Well, and that's the thing. Like, if writing without contractions is your style, then that's not a rule that you need to pay attention to, right?
Buried Goddess Saga has 1,000,000 words. Half of them are contractions.
Right.
And then I wrote, then I wrote Dragon Blood Assassin with Andy, and there's not a contraction in there. As a matter of fact, every time I write a contraction, Andy uncontracts it, if that's even the right word to
Why?
use.
Well, and then like
That's
some
the
of
style in which we've written it. It's very formal. It's very epic. It's very verbose.
right.
So is the most important thing to be consistent
Yeah.
with the world you've created?
Absolutely.
100%.
If you begin the book and say one of my rules is I'm going to not use contractions, then be consistent with that rule that you've set out from the
For sure.
beginning.
I had
always-
Go
Sorry,
ahead,
go
Rick.
ahead.
No, you go. I've talked a lot.
I've always felt like you're reading a fantasy book, and theoretically, the people in that book are speaking another language, probably
Right.
a language from another world or past time. So you're translating what they said into modern English. We use contractions in modern English. I just don't see the point in not using them.
No, it's really just the flow. It's the flow that the writer is wanting to get out of it. It
Right.
does feel a little more epic fantasy when it's done in a high setting. It has this, like this feel that you want the flow. I always say that like dialogue is music, but the reality is books are music. All
Yeah.
So that whatever that musical tone you want to set for the book, I get why he wanted those contractions out. It's fine, but that's not how I did it in the Buried Goddess Saga. I got, this is jumping ship, but not quite. I got kicked out of, or I got a post banned, and then I left the group yesterday. And the question was, we all know that a lot of men write terrible women. What is the worst female character you've ever seen written? And I felt like this was a rule moment, and it was prevalent on my mind when we were getting ready for this show. So I responded, what is this women, quote unquote, that we are speaking about? Are all women the same? And perhaps that poorly written woman was perfectly written for that particular woman.
Right.
And I got trashed by a bunch of women, and then the post got banned. But the question for me remains.
Only this group was, so I can never go there.
I won't blast them necessarily, but the reality is, like, they just didn't want an argument. And I'm not a very 2023 guy, but like, this is 2023, and if we're gonna focus on genders and poorly written genders, then let's start to acknowledge that not every person in a particular gender is the same. Some women do like looking at boobs or, whatever, right? Like,
Right.
what are we missing here? This is a rule that needs to be thrown out, and readers are the gatekeepers for some.
I feel like some men write horrible women, but I also feel like it's not given enough attention that a lot of women write really badly written men.
Sure, look at Twilight. Are there any men that in touch with every emotion that they have? I don't know.
Well, also, I read a lot of. I used to read a lot of mainstream science fiction from the 80s and late 70s, and in that era, I mean, female science fiction writers started coming forward, being more important and more significant in the field, and so I read a lot of them, and they're great writers, but almost all of them just write horrible male characters. They have no idea what motivates men. The internal thoughts, the internal monologue of the men. It's like, I don't know anybody like that. Nobody I know as a man thinks like that.
In my experience as a man, we don't have a very deep internal dialogue.
It's not a very verbose, like my wife and I will have discussions, or it's like that I can't remember who did the joke. I think it was Jim Gaffigan, and he was talking about it was Brian Regan. He was talking about going golfing with his friend, and his friend had just got divorced, and he came back and he was talking with his wife, and his wife is asking, well, is he seeing anybody? And he's like, no, I have no idea. And he's like, you just spent the whole day with him. You didn't ask if he was seeing anybody. He's like, no, I didn't. But I do know what kind of driver he's using because he got a new one, right? Because
I love
because
Ronald Reagan.
there are a lot of, I mean, some men would get into that conversation. It really
whole men,
right. It really depends. And again, this kind of goes to a rule, and this rule is focused on characters. If your character, man or woman or whatever, is in touch with that feeling or doing something, then that's fine to write them like that. If they're not, then it's fine to write them otherwise. But not all men have a running verbose monologue in their brain as they're going through their day. And like, I'll be sitting at the table with my cup of coffee looking out the window, and my wife's like, what are you thinking about? And I go, nothing.
Literally nothing.
Literally nothing. And she's like, how can you sit there and not, like, because my wife's is like blah, 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 all the time.
You learn as you get older. You make up something.
Yeah. Isn't it weird that the cloud is floating weird like that? Like, that's strange. But like, that's the thing. Like some
deep, like, I'm just thinking about, the future and what our plans are for 10 years.
Right.
Something.
Right.
Something.
Well, but that's the thing. I think a lot of people get hemmed up on rules like your character has to be this or they have to talk a certain way, and that there are no rule because no one person is the same. Like Jamie or Steve and I could be really close in some aspects, but in other aspects we're not at all. So as you're going through and you're looking at rules for character or male, female rules or whatever, some women are the same mentally speaking as men. They don't have long, like deep thoughts all the time, or they're not focused on whatever it is. Maybe they're more mechanical or engineering inclined than another woman or whatever. And that just goes to their character. It doesn't have anything to do with whether they're bad or good. Like, I don't know of any guy that would look at a hot chick and go, I wonder if she studies algebra. Like, I don't know that the guy would do that, but there are guys that may think like that. So like, it just really depends on the character.
Are we allowed to say hot chick?
Judging people as monoliths is bad form anyway.
For sure.
Like Steve said, all women don't think like this. Like you said, Josh, all men don't think like this. So the codifying rules around that is just silly to begin with.
And I think what they were getting at was those authors that write, the woman looked in the mirror and her breasts bounced, right? Like, I know what they were trying to get at there.
Right.
Yeah.
It just, to me, felt like an unnecessary derisiveness. I think that's the word. Derisiveness, just trying to create drama out of nowhere. And so I wanted to play a little bit, and they weren't happy with me playing a little bit. So it's not the group for me.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to writing rules, you really should take those rules with a grain of salt. And I personally try not to use adverbs because I think there's a better way to get across what you're trying to say than using adverbs. I think using adverbs in dialogue tags is extremely weak. But listen, if you're writing a first draft or you're writing your first book and you don't have the skill set to set the context of what's going on without using adverbs, use the adverbs. But then when you're going back and you're going back and doing a second pass or a third draft or whatever it is, take that time to really look at that adverb. Is it necessary? Can you set the context of what's going on without using that adverb? If you can't, leave the adverb.
I would say that there's also situations where it's not important enough to spend a lot of words to, I mean, there's somewhere it is if it's like a key moment in the book, but if it's just like some line that conveys information that the audience needs to have, and you want to use an adverb instead of using like 3 sentences to describe how the person's feeling, I can see maybe using it.
Well, an easy way to get around that is like, let's just say somebody says something nervously, like that's your dialogue tag. He said nervously. Instead of going, he said nervously, have the dialogue and then say he shot a nervous look to whatever. Right. And that sets up the nervous, but it also gives action to what you're doing, and it shows the character actually doing something. Like if he shoots a furtive glance to a guard, if he's talking with another prisoner, that will set context for he's saying it nervously, instead of just using the adverb, right?
Right, but just
Said
using
while
the
biting
adverb
his
actually,
nails or something.
Yeah.
using the adverb actually follows one rule, which is
Saying something while biting your nails seems problematic.
tell the story in as few words as possible, right? That's one of the rules. I've got
Yeah,
the grammar
true.
rules up right now,
Yeah.
and I've got some other more metaphysical rules, so to speak, up on the side here. And I have this one rule that if you're going to tell me what the character watched or what the character looked at, just don't tell me that, because I already know that you're in the character's head. I don't need to know that he watched something happen, because if you tell me that thing happened, I know that he watched it happen.
Right.
But so we've got like the grammar rules. These make some sense, right? Watch out for homonyms. Of course.
True.
Two words that are spelled the same or mean the same thing, or whatever homonym. I don't have the definition, but we all know what they are, right?
Yeah.
Be specific. That's pretty broad. What if I don't want to be specific at the time? What if I want to create some mystery?
He said unspecifically.
Avoid long sentences.
Go
But
ahead,
what
sir.
if you need a long sentence?
Right. Or the
I
one
think-
that
I
the,
think
the
that-
one that you had in the little deal here where it says don't use sentence fragments. I use
Yes.
sentence fragments all the time because
Right.
like Steve said, that the narrative can be kind of poetry or song or whatever, but you also want to look at white space on your page. And if you've got huge paragraphs, that's
Right.
going to distract from your story potentially. And so if you have short blocks or action that's happening, like he jumped, that's kind of a sentence. It's a full sentence, but it's a short sentence, and you can use shorter sentences or fragments to convey what you're doing, and it kind of speeds up the action.
I love
think
that you
also
said that,
since-
Josh,
since-
because the visual
just keep
flow
talking,
of
Rick.
the page.
Like the fourth time I tried to talk and Bill talked over
gotta
me.
keep going.
Mute his mic. Mute it.
The visual flow of a page is just as important sometimes as the flow of dialogue. The when you see a page, like you said, if it's just chunk, people's eyes will gloss over. They like
Yeah.
to see the tension on the page, and
Right.
it's a subconscious thing, I think.
Ricardo?
I'm sorry,
I
Rick,
was
what
going
were
to
you
say
saying?
that sentence fragments are also useful if you are trying to get closer to the mind of the character and what they're thinking in the moment. Like, people, when they talk and when they think, they use sentence fragments. And if you're
Yep.
trying to get closer to their thoughts in that particular scene, you might want to use those to give an indication of what's going through their head.
Well, and
A great-
Especially in dialogue.
Yeah.
it punctuates things sometimes too, right? Like he
Not as
turned
much dialogue, I was thinking, Hank, is inner monologue, but go ahead.
in,
Steve, sorry.
and even in narrative, right?
Yeah.
Because you could go, he turned, period, just in time to see the fist hit him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really he turned just in time to see the fist hit him. That's one sentence.
Right.
But if you
Yeah.
really want to punctuate his turning and then let them really make them know what happened,
Right.
don't use words you don't know the meaning of. I think we can all agree.
Can I just say really quickly, I want to tag on what Rick said.
Inconceivable,
because
Steve.
Rick
Inconceivable.
Rick said using sentence fragments as a way to get inside the character's head or show something. I'm reading the Last Orphan X book right now, and in this particular book is the first time that he ever gets captured by a government agency, and that really affected him. And so throughout the book, he has fragments from this big chase scene that's happening. And one of the things is, the character Evan is a fantastic shot. He almost always hits what he's shooting at because he's so good. But in this particular instance, he missed. And Greg Horwitz uses sentence fragments from that sequence to show that Evan, in a particular instance, is having flashes of thought or memory about what's happening, but it's only the fragment, like missing. Like you'll have a a paragraph of narrative and then a blip of text and he missed by 2 meters or whatever, and then goes on, because that not only are you showing the action and the scene, but you're showing the mental process of what's happening in his mind as he's going through things, and you're showing that it actually affected him deeply as a character. Instead of just saying this really deeply affected him, you can get, again, through context and the dramatic nature of how you're using those fragments and how you're using those incidents to show that this thing really affected him. And I thought that was a really good way to present that, narratively speaking.
I think the bottom line for a lot of these rules is that I hear editors especially talk about them all the time, and how important they are. But I also feel like, as a reader, before I became a writer, I never noticed any of these rules being broken.
For sure.
Right.
And I don't think most readers do notice them. I think we writers and editors obsess over them, but readers just want a well-told story with compelling characters. And as long as nothing sticks out, like you using an adverb every paragraph, they're not going to notice it. It's just going to like flow right by them. Non-standard dialogue tags. People get into long, heated debates about non-standard dialogue tags. Readers don't notice them unless you overuse them. They don't notice any of that stuff unless you overuse it. So if the readers aren't, a lot of these rules, the readers, as long as you don't, and I think being cognizant of them is good because you don't want to overuse them, but as long as they're not overused, the readers concentrate on the story and the characters and they just don't care.
Well, speaking of timing and dialogue tags, the standing rule with dialogue tags is generally just use said, right? Don't use any other description, just use said, because people gloss over that as they're reading, just
Right.
internally. They don't really read he said. And now we're talking about audiobooks now,
Yeah,
where they're
definitely.
coming huge, like just growing bigger than they ever have been today. There have been several books where the author is using he said, she said all the time. And as you're listening, you can't just gloss over that. You hear it.
Jim
Right?
Butcher's early Harry Dresden novels. I listened to them on audio,
Yeah.
and there was just sections especially the first book, where it was like he said, said every line.
Right.
I'm like,
right.
So
yeah, I noticed that.
I would argue with Jim. The same argument I always make is that James Marsters got tremendously better after book 3 on narration.
1,000,000%.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree, but it doesn't matter who is narrating. I can hear the said over and over again.
And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Jim didn't stop doing that. But what James Marsters learned how to do was go, Hank, you're sitting on a chair, he said. And like there's this
tonal difference.
Dip in the way that he says the he said, she says. That, and it's something I noticed, Rick, that's why I'm bringing it up as sort of an argument point. The narrator has so much power over. Will Wheaton is a good example. John Scalzi writes he said, she said every single line, and it is overwhelming. And Will Smith says them Will Smith.
Oh my God.
Will Wheaton says them full volume every time. And so you get that blast like you did in those early Jim Butcher books. And I'm an audio guy, so like I pay attention to all that.
Steve, you keep his name out of your mouth.
Yeah. I loved it. He went, that was hilarious.
That was with the Jim Butcher books, that's a great example of a narrator transitioning to a voice actor in that
right.
context.
But again, you have to be careful because if you're writing for audio, which Steve and I do that a lot when we look at our books and we make sure that they're good for audio, like good presentation. Honestly, it really depends on the narrator too sometimes, because you can get a narrator that does voices well. And if he does that, like say you're writing a series, okay, and he gets the first book and he just nails the character voices, if I can get away with it, I'm eliminating all my dialogue tags from the books after that, because if he can do the voices that well, the reader doesn't need them.
Here's the problem. We're the authors, and we assume that the readers remember what the voices are, and I don't think they always do.
Well, I'm not saying I removed them completely, but I try to minimize them because I know in my mind that the narrator is going to do a good job, if it's a good narrator, breaking up those voices.
There's this trend, though, with audiobook people writing for audiobooks where they remove all the dialogue tags because they feel like the narrator can nail it. And
sometimes they can't.
Yeah, man, I listen to even great narrators. Jeff Hayes is one of them, right? And there's sometimes where the authors clearly took out all the dialogue tags, and I go, this is really cool that he's doing this great voice, but I forgot which character this was.
For sure, yeah.
I prefer, honestly, like an action.
Yeah, so do I.
Instead of a dialogue tag, it's just I get bored of writing. He said, she said.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it goes back to one of those things where they're talking about like writing. I can't remember who was writing it. It was a script writing book, and he was talking about if you're having characters have a discussion, have them doing something else during the discussion. Don't just have them stand in a room and talk. Have them eating a banana or do it like, I don't know, making a Pinewood Derby car, something that gives you, the writer, the ability to present who's talking in a way that's not doing dialogue tags. Like Rick said, doing action. He picked up a box and put it over here. And you can use that as the tag to ground the reader in the conversation, to point out who is talking.
And then another great point is it written in first person or is it written in third person?
100%.
In first person, James Crowley, the Raptors books, all the ones I've written, I will opt for I said or she said before a dialogue tag, because the dialogue tags look very unnatural when you're the first person character. Now, I know Drop Trooper was written first person as well, and I don't remember how you did stuff like that, Rick. But you know, when Cam says something,
I don't remember either.
I feel like I'd have noticed if it was really just a lot of dialogue tags, because sometimes he struck up a cigarette. Hey there, guys, period. He moved his hands. I'm just doing that. Sometimes it gets overwhelming.
For sure.
Like, I don't need to know every action and stage direction that this character takes.
Right.
Well, that goes to experience over rules, right? Like you can get to a point in your writing where you know what is too much and what is not enough, and then you can kind of balance that out. But again, it takes writing, and it takes a lot of reading to understand where those rules can really be broken, because we can talk all day about how I break a rule or how I ignore a rule, but a lot of that won't translate fundamentally to a writer's skill box unless they do it, unless they kind of work out what their thing is. And if their thing is adverbs and they're really good at it and the reader likes it, who am I to say that that's wrong? Like Steve said, money talks, right? So we've mentioned 50 Shades of Grey before. I don't want to knock on it too much, but that book, for whatever reason, resonated with a crap ton of people and made $1 billion. And, you know, the same thing with a lot of books that I look at and I'm like, man, I really don't understand this. But again, that goes back to me as a writer looking at the work, not the story. I'm looking at the way it's written, because you know, as writers, that's what we do. But like Rick said, readers don't normally give a crap about all that. So, you know, speaking about just rules in general, they're good for writers to know and understand why things are a certain way, but also they're not set in stone. I don't know that there's any rules that say you have to do this to tell a good story, because you can write anything. Like if you're writing an unreliable character or an unreliable narrator, there's a lot of things you can do, especially if that narrator's first person. None of the rules apply then. You can do whatever you want. If you like David Baldacci's The Memory Man, like the way that dude's mind works, he wrote the book the way the dude's mind works.
Right. And there's still a rule that he created for that character.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
There's no rules when you're writing something bonkers like a Chuck Palahniuk book.
For 100%.
Right. I don't know. I tend to look at the rules as we've all had a lot of editors, I would assume. I mean, I supply Rick's editors. You've gone through at least 4 that I know of, I think. And I've had several.
Is it only 4?
I think. But I have some editors that they edit my books and I go, this isn't what I wanted to do. Right. And then I have other ones that go, oh, that makes it a lot better. And so it also comes down to who your editor is and what rules they follow. But
and does your editor have the same vision for your book that you do?
Yeah.
Right. 100%.
Steve, you said something a minute ago. You said never use words that you don't know the proper definition for. Well, I have a character that I write, one of my favorite characters, and he says stuff that he doesn't understand all the time. But that becomes a character trait, and people dismiss him because he just talks ignorantly all the time. And then every now and then he says something truly profound, and people just miss it. And could have saved themselves so much heartache if they would have just listened to what he had to say. But everybody dismisses him because he just says crazy stuff all the time that he doesn't understand what it means. But that becomes a character trait, and that's not me as the writer saying stuff that I don't understand, but the character doesn't understand. And so even I guess what I'm saying is even hard and fast rules that everyone should abide by, when it becomes a character trait, you can kind of take the gloves off.
Like
one of my
you
favorite
may be careful running less than 12 parsecs.
Right. One of my favorite lines in Cold as Hell is when this guy Deputy Dale says, "We're not going to come here and defecate the dead." And James Crowley in her dialogue goes, "He means desecrate, but I'm going to let it go because the situation, whatever."
We don't want to do either one.
We don't want to do either. Brandon Sanderson.
Defecating the dead will ruin your day.
Yeah.
Brandon Sanderson recently got slammed in that ridiculous article that we shouldn't even give any attention to. But one of the things that was brought up was something that I noticed in his superhero series, and that is the main character, admittedly throughout the whole series, is really bad at metaphors.
Like Mr. Furious?
Is that a thing? What is that?
Mystery Men from Mystery Men.
Oh,
Ben
is that one of his things?
He kept mixing metaphors.
Like, so this one was like,
don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind shines.
This was a little more like yeah, that's funny. This was a little more like it was like a potato on a plate in the mic. I'm not really good at metaphors like that. He would do that constantly, and this writer was like, Brandon Sanderson's so bad at metaphors that he has a character who admits he's bad at metaphors. And like, to me, that was missing the whole point of creating a character with a tick.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, Brandon's fine at metaphors. He's written 10 million words.
Right.
Previously.
Although it's fun.
And a lot of his
in a first person book, if you don't know like the word for some technical term, like what's the plural of octopus, you don't even have to look it up. Just like, what is it? Octopi, octopuses? I don't know. You just have them think that.
Well, and speaking about like metaphors and stuff like that, like your metaphors have to make sense in the world. So like a lot of Brandon's metaphors don't have any basis in our world because they're in a fantasy setting. So a lot of his metaphors are twisted and different because of where they're used at. I mean, that's not necessarily a rule. It's just
but I pinged my James Crowley fan group to ask for like Westerny sounding metaphors one time, and I'm like, and if yours is good, I'll use it. And one of them was like he was I don't know, closed up as tight as a preacher's flask. Another one was tight as a nun's thighs, whatever it was, right? And like they just worked so well, I put them in the book.
Yeah,
burrowed in like a tick on a coon.
It's hard to come up with good Western phrases. I have a notebook of them, but I steal them from everywhere. I don't mind saying that. I live in Texas. People say crazy stuff here. Crazy stuff. and you go, what does that even mean? I don't know, but it sounds great.
You're right. Here's one that I ran across, and we all have heard this. We probably have given this advice. Every editor software I've ever seen will flag for this. Dabble, we use Pro Writing Aid, as a plugin for our software, and it will flag passive voice.
100%.
Everybody looks for it. Everybody says, "Is there ever a place for passive voice?" And
Yes.
other than in dialogue where that's a character trait.
A place exists for passive voice.
Okay. Do you?
I find that so every time I have passive sentences, as I'm going through my edits, if I see he was running, and I can change it to he ran.
Yeah.
He ran so far away.
Then I do it. If I change it and I feel like it doesn't still convey the same emotion, then I don't change it. It is personal. It's not an everyday. It's not an every. You can't just blanket your whole book with that rule.
I agree, and I think there are some settings where it's better to use passive than not. Like if you're trying to save words and you can say the room was orange or something like that, like technically that's passive, but it's also descriptive, so it doesn't really have the same weight as he was running.
Is the room was orange passive?
No, that's not passive. That's just
yeah.
A good example would be a guy walks into a bar and he sees a guy at the end of the bar and he says he was staring at his glass.
Okay, yeah, okay.
He was staring at his glass. It is because he stared at his glass would be the non-passive version.
I thought that it would be more like an example. Like a decision was made.
No, that's another way. That's another way of doing it. But if the word "was" is in there, it becomes passive.
Right.
And I guess by that merit, the room was orange. Yeah, I guess same thing.
Because I mean, you could write it. You could say he walked into the orange room.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so there are some things that may or may not be passive, but as writers, you look and you're ingrained to take was, had, were, like all these.
Some butthole had painted that room orange. That's active, right?
Yeah.
There's another way of doing it. But like think about the difference between he was staring at his glass and he stared at his glass. There's a weight that comes along with
right.
He was staring at his glass.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's personal, right? Like you might go, no, there's no weight to that. Take it out.
Well, and Hank mentioned Pro Writing Aid. I forget about Pro Writing Aid a lot while I'm writing. I never use it while I'm writing. But I just submitted a short story to Bain and I used Pro Writing Aid before I did it. And I'm glad that I did because it found a lot of things. And sometimes you're writing and you think you're writing active, but it flags as passive. And then you look at it and you go, oh yeah, that is a better way to write that. And I would encourage anyone writing to use something, but Pro Writing Aid is really good because it
Dabble. So that's a great.
Yeah. And 100%. Like I write in Dabble, I use Pro Writing. A lot of the times I'll export to Word and then Word has the app Pro Writing Aid that you can just open the app and it's a little bit. Make sure you hit save before you close it out. That's just a little tidbit from my experience because I went through for like 2 hours fixing something in the app and then didn't hit save and nothing changed in the Word document. And I'm like, oh, fantastic for me. I get to do it again. Absolutely cool. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of times during a first draft, I'll use passive as I'm writing, but then go back and I do try to change it to active because it does like you're saying, Steve, there are things that have weight as passive verbs, but there's a lot of times where you like in your mind as you're writing it, yeah, that sounds fine. But then you go back and read it later and I'm like, nah, there was a better way to write that. And so with passive, it is kind of a crapshoot, but predominantly like 98% of the time, passive verbs can be removed with a little bit of time or Pro Writing Aid or something that you can take those out and change them. It does make the work stronger.
But see, Hank, your subtitle on this was writing rules and knowing when to break them. So I think that there's a genuine question here we're saying, yes, that rule could be broken, but how do we know?
Right.
I think again that comes to experience, right? Like
I don't know
if
that's not a tangible enough answer. I don't think.
well, you're right. I think that you could look at one of your first books and go, I didn't understand the rule correctly, and so I didn't apply it correctly.
How'd you learn it? Right? Like be like saying, how do I take a great jump shot? It just comes with experience. Yeah, but like at some point you got to learn how to take a jump shot. And
for sure,
I learned by reading.
I agree with that, but by reading who? Stephen King?
No,
Right.
not reading craft books, but by reading.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
A wide variety of books in the genre that I like to read, that I like to write. I mean, sure, some of them are, worse about you breaking those rules than others, but I feel like a lot of them concentrate on those rules. So if you read a wide variety of authors, you'll see the majority on one side instead of the other.
Yeah, I agree.
So here's a question.
Dying, by the way.
Here's a question. Take your writer hat off and put your reader hat on. Have you ever read a book where the passive voice threw you out of the story?
I know that I have. I know that I have personally, because I'm mostly I run Athon, but I mostly listen to traditionally published books, and oftentimes when I choose an indie book at sort of almost at random, I'm not saying an Athon book, but just like, hey, this one's gotten really popular, let me see why.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of indie authors write passively. They don't have the editors, because they're not spending 10 grand on an editor. I'm not saying all editors are worth 10 grand, but like when you're reading it and everything as he was doing, he was seeing, he was going, he watched this, he did this, all of that stuff becomes overwhelming sometimes. For sure.
And again, I think that comes back to time investment and experience as a writer. And I think that like I read indie, but not a lot, because like Steve said, the quality sometimes is not where I want it to be for my reading time. They are good to read as examples of sometimes what not to do. Right. And then if you read a bad book, like he's saying, and everything was passive and you're like, this is pulling me out, that's a really good indication as a writer to go, this is not what I want to do. But if you're looking at it as a reader, from a reader standpoint, I don't care about punctuation. I don't care about anything like that. As long as it is a good book that's engaging, I'll read it all day long. But I think for authors, it's really hard to take that hat off. It's super hard to take that hat off, whether you're reading a book.
I think it colors how we read books after it becomes, and it's hard to go back to the way you used to.
Yep. Well, and a lot of things that you read and you're like, I really like that. It doesn't translate equally 1-to-1 to your writing, right? Because sometimes the actual writing of a thing is harder to do than you think it is. So you read, I don't know, say a really good book, Game of Thrones. Let's just throw that out there. The writing is fantastic. Say what you want about the author or the story or whatever. The writing is really, really good. But knowing that writing is really good does not always translate to I can sit down and write Game of Thrones, because though that skill set needs to be developed. And you have to understand fundamentally what he's doing as a writer in the narrative, because you can write like anybody. You can, Stephen King has a really specific way of writing. Like if you read his books, they all read basically the same as you're looking at the narrative, like just the style in which he writes. And it's hard to duplicate and do it well. You can write as the same way he writes, but maybe the story won't be there. You'll have the style, but not the story. Or you can do the story and not the style. It's really difficult to say, pull this and do that, and you'll have a good book.
I want to qualify something. I said that I listen to a lot of trad, don't listen to a lot of indie. I want to be careful because I know there's a lot of indie writers and I'm friends with a lot of indie writers and I'm an indie writer. So like, I don't want to make it seem like I think indie writing is bad. I just want to remind everybody that when we're talking about the difference between trad pub and indie pub, there's, something like 600,000 new indie books a year versus, 150 trad pub in maybe the genre. And so sometimes it's a lot easier to just go, this one I know is going to be good. I'm going to read it. When I say good, I mean well written.
Yeah.
Versus let me take a shot on this with the time that I have.
For sure.
And so I don't know, the rules I think are meant to be broken, but we have to determine, I asked, how do we do it? Right. Like, I think listening to our editors is very important.
100%.
There's been a stigma in indie writing for about 10 years that like, we don't need editors. And I think Hank brought that up earlier, but the reality is, especially if you're with a publisher, small publisher, and I'm not talking to Rick or anybody right now, but like when an editor says something, it is oftentimes in our egotistical handbasket to go, no, I don't need to do that.
For sure.
However, if it keeps coming up in a book, I usually take it to somebody else. It's usually Rhett or it's usually, Josh or whatever. And I go, can you read these two things and just tell me which works better?
Mm-hmm.
And if the person agrees with the editor, and I don't tell them which one's mine, if the person agrees with the editor, I go, okay, I guess it's 2-1. I'll just move on. I'm not going to die on this hill.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then Rick would probably go, I don't even think about it. I'm just going to let the editor.
I just said accept all. And
accept all.
Changes.
Right.
Right. Because it's not going to so drastically change your book that it matters. And sometimes it's easier to just go, if the editor caught this, it's worth taking.
For sure.
Well, that also is an argument for what we said earlier about finding an editor that has the same vision as you, so that you can trust that feedback that you're getting from them. Because sometimes you'll just get wildly, off the wall feedback that is going to alter your story. But if you've done your due diligence ahead of time and know that this editor cares about your story, has the same vision as you, then they're probably not going to take the freight train down a dirt road.
I mean, that's a great point. And the one thing I'll say about that is in Weaponized, in the beginning of Weaponized, I'm a huge proponent of gaining information through context. I hate info dumps, so I try not to do them at all, and I leave almost everything to context. And in the beginning of the story, there's a lot of things going on that I don't explain. I just leave it to context for the reader to figure out. I think readers are smarter than a lot of authors give credit to, and they can figure out what's happening just through the story. But this particular editor that I had look at it was really hung up on the fact that he didn't understand this or he didn't understand that. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. None of that matters, because you will gain that knowledge through the context of the story. And so it, like you said about the editor, you have to make sure that the editor is seeing what you're trying to say. And if they're not, then maybe choose a different editor or go do what Steve said and go with, like, give your author friends a view at it. It looks like Hank lost his internet, and I'm not sure what that means for the broadcast, because I cannot stop the live broadcast. I don't think anybody can. I've got a hard break.
We'll have to stay on here forever.
Yeah,
you can leave. I'll stay. Rick had an editor that we provided to him that kept changing his dialogue.
Oh yeah, I hate that.
Right. And sometimes
correcting the grammar in dialogue.
Right.
Sometimes, as a publisher, we don't know precisely what our editors are doing, other than they've passed the tests. They've done some great samples for us. And the only way we ever know if authors don't like them is if authors tell us, I don't like him.
For sure.
And so Rick came to us once, and I think it was maybe 3 books in a row. It's like, I'm at a point where I don't want to do this anymore. And he's making more work for me. And I think that's when we switched. But that tells the story, right? If you're working with an editor and you don't like something they're doing, and maybe you tell them, stop doing this, and they still refuse to stop doing it, it's time to get a new editor.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, like you're saying, the editor, typically speaking, the editor understands the rules of writing, like the language of writing correctly, and so they'll be able to find a lot of that stuff. But it just goes to,
I think looking back on it, I think maybe they just used a program like Grammarly and didn't look at what it was
That is
changing.
possibly true, 100%. And that's the danger of getting a sample edit from an editor that does really well, because they're going to edit, I don't know, 4,000 words. And then I have no idea if they're just running it through Grammarly for the rest of the stuff. Unless an author comes to me and goes, hey, this doesn't seem right. So, yeah, I don't know where Hank went.
he's calling Comcast, so I don't know that I don't know that he can end it, but I'm messaging
If you have to,
him
if
right
you have
now.
to go, Josh, it's okay. We can keep jabbering at each
Well,
other.
the guy's not here yet, so I got a guy coming to look to fix my
Okay.
IC, but he's not here yet. I'm gonna see if he can give me his information
Good,
so I
good
can
time to get
log
it
in and
fixed in
log out.
April before you really need it.
Rick asked me in a private message what happened to my finger. Nothing. You know how some people bite their nails? I tend to bite the skin around my nails, whatever, and I made myself bleed pretty bad. So
If you're watching this and you've wondering why we're just kind of rambling now, it's because Hank, our wonderful host and controller of the internet right now, has lost his internet. So I don't know that there's going to be anything of value to watch from this point on. But thank you for coming and hanging out with us today. I'm not sure when Hank's going to be able to jump on and kill this, or maybe he can send me the info to
interestingly,
kill it.
though, that like you can't do that, or like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that he got booted and we didn't just lose the show.
Yeah, well, because it's hosted on StreamYard, and so Hank just
Josh.
lost his. Yeah,
Try. Yeah, I assume you have his number to text him.
I'm messaging him right now.
Suggest to him that he use the Wi-Fi hotspot on his phone to hook back up long enough to cut it off.
Do we feel like we accomplished anything today?
I never feel like I accomplished anything.
Nice.
No, I mean, I think that people know the rules in general. I think a lot of writers spend a lot of time reading books about the rules and how to write well and craft. And I think knowing that it's not the end of the world if you break them, if you do it on, as long as you know them and do it on purpose, is important, because honestly, books that follow all those rules, that they're all the same. You know, they're a little predictable in the structure. And I like when people do something different. I mean, some of my favorite science fiction books are from people who have interesting and non-standard ways of writing.
Yeah.
What's your favorite book, Rick?
Ever?
I don't know. Your favorite sci-fi book, or at least
that's a hard one.
Just one of them.
One of them, Between Planets by Robert Heinlein.
That's one Robert Heinlein I don't know that I've read.
He's back.
Hey,
Back.
Hank.
I have no idea what happened, but my internet just died.
Well, we killed 8 minutes for you.
Well, I appreciate it.
I'll say really quickly, we've been kind of bashing on Stephen King a lot, but one of my favorite books of all time is the Gunslinger. I'll read that all the time. Yeah, the Gunslinger, and then Wasteland, and all the way up through Wizard and Glass. I absolutely love those books. And he breaks a crap ton of rules in those books, but I think it really comes down to, like, as an author, what are you trying to do with your books?
He even breaks his own rules in those books.
Well,
for sure.
there's a scripture. I'm going to close this sermon with this scripture. There's a scripture that says that teachers are held to a higher standard, right? And so as pastors, we all go, well, crap, I better watch everything that I say. And the reason why I felt comfortable sort of calling out Stephen King is the moment you write a book on how to write a book, you are opening yourself up to being held to a higher standard.
For sure.
And so if it was just Joe Schmo, I wouldn't be ragging on him, but he wrote a book that we consider foundational
Right.
on how to write.
Yeah.
Well, that's why when I did my little YouTube series on writing, I didn't say how to write a great novel. I just said how to write science fiction that doesn't suck. I
Right.
feel like
If,
that's a low bar, and I can probably clear it.
As a pitch for anybody that's wanting to learn how to write good story and doesn't really care about the rules of the story, Google Brandon Sanderson college lecture or BYU lecture. He has like 2 or 3 seasons of those where he videotapes and broadcasts his college class for free on YouTube, and they are really good foundational pieces for whether you're written no books or 20 books. You can watch those and gain knowledge from them.
Does he use actual tapes, Josh?
I was thinking the same thing.
I hate you so much.
Is that like paper and
I hate it. It exist.
He videotapes himself with
But, you know, even those Sanderson lectures, he'll tell you this is his take on becoming a marketable author in this market today.
For sure.
He's not saying this is how to be to write purple prose and to be to have the best of everything. He said this is how you become a marketable author in today's market.
Step 1, take over one of the most famous series of all time.
Step
2, write whatever the hell you want.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Well, guys, I got to bounce. It's a great show.
That's
Thanks,
our
everybody.
time for today. Thank you guys for joining us. And as usual, we stirred up more questions than answers. And that's our job here, apparently.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Hank.
Have a great day.